Your own mother stands up at Thanksgiving dinner, wine glass raised, and announces to your entire family that you're a deadbeat who owes her $50,000. The room goes silent. Everyone stares at you like you're a criminal. But here's the twist. Every penny she claims you owe her was already yours to begin with. This is the story of how I exposed the woman who stole my father's legacy and tried to make me pay for it twice. If you've ever dealt with family manipulation or had someone try to rewrite history to make themselves look like a saint, this story is going to be different. Make sure to hit that like button if you're ready for some serious family drama, and subscribe because we're diving deep into a revenge story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust. My name is Anna, and when I was 19, I thought my mother Deborah was my guardian angel. It was a crisp September morning when she called me into our kitchen, the same kitchen where my father Benjamin used to make pancakes every Sunday before cancer took him when I was 15. Deborah sat across from me at our worn wooden table, her hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug, and delivered what I thought was the most generous offer of my life. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice soft and maternal, "I want to help you pay for college. All of it. Just focus on your studies and don't worry about the money. Family takes care of family." I remember the relief washing over me like a warm wave. Student loans terrified me, and watching my friends stress about debt made my stomach twist. Here was my mother, wearing that familiar expression of sacrifice that had become her trademark since Dad died, offering to shoulder this enormous burden. "Are you sure, Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Anna, your father would have wanted this. I'm just doing what he can't." But even in that moment of gratitude, I should have noticed the seeds she was already planting. At family gatherings, she'd make these little comments that felt like gentle reminders but carried an edge I couldn't quite identify. "Not everyone gets a free ride to college, you know," she'd say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes when my cousin Rachel mentioned her student loan payments. "You should be grateful I'm investing in you, Anna," she'd add during dinner conversations about my grades, her voice carrying just enough emphasis to make everyone nod in approval at her selflessness. At the time, I brushed these comments off. I thought it was just Deborah being Debra, dramatic, attention-seeking, but ultimately loving. I had no idea she was laying a psychological trap that would spring 10 years later with devastating precision. College became my escape. I threw myself into my studies, made friends, dated a guy named Jack who played guitar and made me laugh. I called Debra every Sunday, updating her on my classes, my part-time job at the campus bookstore, my plans for the future. She always sounded proud, always reminded me how lucky I was to have such opportunities. "Your cousin Gregory is working 2 jobs just to afford community college," she'd say. "Count your blessings, sweetheart." I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing, landed a good job at a tech startup, and slowly built a life for myself. By the time I was 29, I had my own apartment, a reliable car, and even some savings. I felt stable, independent, and grateful for the head start Deborah had given me. That's when she decided to collect. It was Thanksgiving, 2018. The whole family had gathered at my Aunt Janet's house, the same sprawling colonial where we'd celebrated holidays since I was a child. The table was crowded with familiar faces: Janet and her husband Patrick, my cousins Rachel and Alexander, my grandmother Diane, and several others. The turkey was carved, the wine was flowing, and everyone was sharing what they were thankful for. Then Deborah stood up. She was wearing her favorite burgundy dress, the one that made her look elegant and authoritative. She raised her wine glass with theatrical precision, and the room fell into that expectant hush that follows when someone clearly has something important to say. "I think," she began, her voice carrying that saccharine sweetness I'd grown to associate with her most manipulative moments, "it's about time my daughter paid me back for college. With interest." The silence was deafening. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, felt the weight of their judgment before they even understood what was happening. My throat went dry, my hands started shaking. "Mom," I managed to choke out, "you told me it was a gift." But she cut me off with a wave of her hand, and that familiar smirk that used to make me feel small as a child. "Oh, don't twist my words, Anna. You owe me $50,000 and everyone here knows it. I sacrificed everything to give you opportunities, and now you're successful enough to pay me back? It's only fair." I looked around the table desperately. My cousin Rachel was staring at me with disappointment. Alexander shook his head. Even my grandmother Diane looked confused and vaguely disapproving. In that moment, Deborah had successfully painted me as an ungrateful daughter who was refusing to honor her debts. That night, after most of the family had left, Deborah cornered me in Janet's kitchen. The warm, welcoming room suddenly felt cold and threatening. "You're nothing without me," she hissed, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I made you who you are. Pay me what you owe, or I'll make sure this whole family sees who you really are. A selfish, ungrateful child who abandons the people who sacrificed for her." The harassment started immediately. My phone buzzed constantly with text messages. "Anna, we need to discuss your payment plan. I'm disappointed in your attitude. Family loyalty used to mean something." Within days, other family members started reaching out. My Aunt Catherine called to express her concern about my financial irresponsibility. My cousin Julie sent a Facebook message saying she was shocked to learn I was refusing to pay my debts. The worst part was the doubt that crept in. Had I misunderstood? Was it possible that she'd actually said it was a loan all those years ago and I'd just heard what I wanted to hear? The gaslighting was so complete, so systematic, that I began questioning my own memory. But then, during one particularly sleepless night in December, something shifted. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I remembered something my father used to say. "Anna, when someone tries to rewrite history, the truth is usually hiding in the paperwork." Benjamin had been meticulous about financial records. If Deborah had really paid for my college out of her own pocket, there would be a paper trail, bank statements, withdrawal records, something to show where that money had come from. I spent the next 3 days digging through boxes in my storage unit, files I hadn't touched since moving out of Deborah's house years earlier, birth certificates, tax documents, old report cards. And then I found them. Bank statements from the years I was in college, carefully preserved in one of Dad's old manila folders. My hands trembled as I spread them across my kitchen table. There it was, clear as day. Every single tuition payment had come from a life insurance account, Benjamin's life insurance account. Money that had been specifically designated for my care and education after his death. Money that was legally mine, managed by Deborah as my guardian until I turned 18, and then held in trust for educational expenses. My mother hadn't sacrificed a single penny of her own money. She had used my inheritance, money my father had paid premiums on for years, money he had intended specifically for my future, and then taken credit for it. For a decade, she had let me believe in her generosity while secretly planning to charge me interest on my own inheritance. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as a hot knot in my chest and spread through my entire body until my hands were shaking and I could barely see straight. But underneath the anger was something else. Clarity. For the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I made copies of everything: bank statements, insurance documents, trust agreements. Then I called a lawyer, Alexander's college roommate Gregory, who specialized in financial fraud. He looked over the documents and confirmed what I already knew. What Deborah had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally questionable. Misrepresenting the source of funds used for a minor's care, then attempting to collect payment for those funds, could potentially constitute fraud. "Do you want to press charges?" Gregory asked. I thought about it for a long moment. "Not yet," I said. "But I want to know that I could if I needed to." Christmas dinner was held at Janet's house again. Same dining room, same long table, but this time I came prepared. I had a manila folder tucked discreetly in my purse, and I'd spent hours rehearsing what I would say. Deborah was in her element, holding court at one end of the table, regaling everyone with stories of her sacrifices and her disappointment in my lack of gratitude. She was wearing her martyr mask perfectly, sighing dramatically whenever someone mentioned college expenses. "I just don't understand how I raised such a selfish daughter," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I gave her everything, and she can't even acknowledge what she owes me." The table was nodding along sympathetically. Even Patrick, who had always been kind to me, looked disappointed. This was her moment of triumph. She had successfully turned the entire family against me. That's when I stood up. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "I don't owe you a single penny. Because you didn't pay for my college. Dad did." The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. My cousin Rachel's fork clattered against her plate. "What are you talking about?" Janet asked, confusion written across her face. I pulled out the manila folder and began spreading documents across the table, careful to keep my movements calm and deliberate. "These are the bank statements from my college years," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Every tuition payment, every dormitory fee, every cent that was supposedly Deborah's generous gift. It all came from Dad's life insurance policy, money he left specifically for my education, money that was already mine." The silence was absolute. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear someone's sharp intake of breath. Deborah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, denial, and then something that looked almost like panic. It was still," she stammered. "You stole credit for Dad's provision," I continued, feeling a decade of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. "You let me believe for 10 years that you had sacrificed for me, that I owed you gratitude for your generosity. You made me feel guilty for accepting help that was my birthright. And then you tried to charge me $50,000 for my own inheritance." The room erupted. Janet grabbed one of the bank statements, her eyes scanning the numbers. Alexander leaned over her shoulder, pointing at specific entries. Patrick muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Jesus Christ." "This says Benjamin Richards Life Insurance Trust." Rachel read aloud. "Anna, this is your money." Deborah was still trying to salvage the situation, her voice getting higher and more desperate. "I was his wife. I managed that money. I raised her. I deserved—" "You deserved nothing," I said, my voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "You were the trustee. Your job was to use that money for my benefit, not to take credit for it and then try to collect payment later." But I wasn't done. I had one more card to play. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said quietly. "Misusing a minor's inheritance funds and then attempting to collect payment for those funds. Well, let's just say there are legal terms for that kind of behavior." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Diane, my grandmother, looked like she might faint. Catherine was staring at Deborah with a mixture of horror and disgust. "Anna," Deborah said, her voice now small and pleading, "you wouldn't." "I won't press charges," I said, and I saw relief flicker across her face. "But I'm done. No more guilt trips, no more manipulation, no more playing the victim while painting me as the villain. We're finished." I gathered up my documents, tucked them back into the folder, and walked toward the door. Behind me I could hear the beginning of what sounded like a very uncomfortable family conversation. The fallout was swift and complete. Within a week I started getting phone calls from family members who wanted to apologize. Rachel called to say she was horrified by what she'd learned. Catherine sent a long text message, expressing her regret for doubting me. Even Patrick, who rarely got involved in family drama, reached out to say he was sorry for not seeing through Deborah's manipulation sooner. Deborah's reputation, the carefully crafted image of the sacrificing single mother, was destroyed overnight. The same relatives who had once praised her selflessness now whispered about her deception. The woman who had built her identity on being the family martyr was suddenly seen for what she really was, a manipulator who had stolen credit for her dead husband's love and provision. I changed my phone number and blocked her on all social media. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from her psychological games, free from the constant undercurrent of guilt and obligation that had colored every interaction we'd had since I was 19. 3 months later, I got a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Deborah, 2 pages of handwritten apologies and explanations, begging me to call her, promising she had changed. I read it once, then threw it away without a second thought. Because sometimes revenge isn't about making someone pay. It's about exposing the truth and watching their house of lies collapse under its own weight. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to a manipulator is simply refuse to be manipulated anymore. My father's love had protected me even after death, and I had finally honored that gift by refusing to let anyone else claim credit for it. The inheritance Deborah tried to steal wasn't just money. It was the knowledge that I was worthy of love and support without having to earn it through guilt and obligation. And that knowledge, once reclaimed, was something no one could ever take away from me again. The most powerful moment wasn't seeing Deborah's face crumble. It was walking away knowing that I would never again doubt my own worth or my father's love. She had tried to rewrite our family's history, but the truth was there all along, waiting patiently in those manila folders. Some people asked why I didn't press charges, why I didn't make her pay financially for what she'd done. But I realized that the most devastating punishment for someone who built their identity on being seen as virtuous was simply being seen clearly. Deborah lost something more valuable than money. She lost the family's respect, and she lost her ability to control the narrative. My father Benjamin had provided for me twice, once through his insurance policy, and once through his meticulous record-keeping that eventually set me free. If this story resonated with you, or if you've dealt with family manipulation yourself, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had someone try to rewrite history to make themselves look better? Hit that like button if you believe the truth always finds a way to surface, and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to be victims of manipulation. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to play the game anymore.